Berlin, 1940. Curtains drawn, cigarettes burning low. A minister hears an American promise 50,000 planes a year. He laughs, certain artisans and aces will outrun shopkeepers and schedules. Across the Atlantic, a whistle answers. Clipboards replace speeches, shift clocks replace boasts. Tool steel rides, flat cars under tarps. New hands learn rivet rhythm. The wager hardens quality versus quantity, elegance versus tact time. In ledgers, truth gathers like wings in rows. This war will be decided by calendars, not compliments, by throughput, not theater. The shocking truth begins here. Numbers, not refinements, will flood the sky and utterly grind empires down. They enter the war believing precision will substitute for scale. Air ministries praise hand-fitted tolerances, blueprints dense with curves. Production chiefs prefer craftsmen to conveyors. The fighter sheds weight with clever machining. Engines sing at frightening compression. Airframes are tuned like violins, each one a near-custom instrument. Pilots become aristocrats of performance logbooks thick with duels and doctrine. Factories, though, are mazes-long setups, brittle supplier chains, jigs that take months to alter. Model changes consume winters. Spares trail the front by rail cars, not fleets. Managers guard secrets, not interchangeability. Provinces guard pride, not standard parts. Workflow bends around masters, not meters. When orders surge, lines buckle. When bombing scatters subcontractors, nobody else holds the drawings. Cycle times stretch. Rework hides in corners. Launch rates live and die by a few toolmakers' nerves. There is glory in the product and gravity in the process. The calendar does not care. Across the table, the enemy studies takt, time swaps fixtures by night, and teaches novices to hit tolerance by gauge, not intuition. The axis doubles down on refinement, and the clock extracts its rent hours become weeks. Weeks become quarters, while the sky demands squadrons, not prototypes. Expeditions wait. Inventories whisper uncomfortable math. They laughed because the machine they worshipped was beautiful, intricate, and ruinously slow. Call it Weapon A, the archetype of Axis excellence, a thoroughbred airframe wrapped around a tightly wound engine, every surface hand-massaged until tolerances kissed. To build one was to stage a small opera. Fuselage frames came off jigs that took months to set and days to re-square after a bomb tremor. Wing spars demanded alloy batches with temper windows so narrow a foreman checked them by thumb feel. Rivet lines were laid by masters who rejected pieces that a gauge would accept craftsman's pride, overruling calendar truth. Costs ballooned in places accountants could not easily see. Precision demanded tool steels that wore down faster under hurried shifts. Carburetors and supercharger stages wanted microfinishes that only a handful of grinders could hold. The wiring looms bent around bespoke instrument clusters that changed with each variant. And there were always variants. The enemy of flow is change, and Weapon A lived on change, a new armament fit for this front. A revised cowling for that altitude field mod slipping upstream into production because aces swore they felt the difference. Every improvement shaved seconds in the sky and added weeks on the floor. Time stretched. A subassembly stuck behind a jig repair idled a half-dozen stations. A rejected alloy heat stalled an entire bay. A master toolmaker's illness set the calendar back more than a raid. Drawings were distributed with caution and hierarchies only. The original shop held the full print only. The original crew really knew the quirks, and so subcontractors became supplicants, waiting on approvals that moved by courier instead of by doctrine. Rework that quiet killer hid in the corners, one misdrilled rib here, a misaligned gun mount there until final assembly discovered it and the whole choreography rewound. This is why they mocked the American number. 50,000, 100,000, not without murdering quality, not without building flying tractors, not without accepting a sky full of crude airframes that would shed parts like leaves. They had seen American cars stamped simple, indifferent to the nuance that wins a duel. Weapon A was none of that. Its engine was a jeweler's piece that sang when the mix and boost were precise to the hair. Its cooling pattern only settled when baffling and venting were tuned by men who felt flow in their knuckles. Its guns harmonized to a pattern taped on the hangar wall by a crew chief with a violinist's ear. You could not automate that ear. You could not stamp that song. And Weapon A was expensive in more than money. It was expensive in attention. A factory that built it could not pivot easily. A province that supplied it could not risk sharing dies with another line. A minister who protected it could not tolerate the sacrilege of interchangeable parts that were merely good enough. So they laughed at the American promise because in their world, to promise numbers was to confess mediocrity. Numbers meant concessions. Numbers meant standardization. Numbers meant handing a masterpiece to a novice with a torque wrench and trusting the gauge instead of the gut. To them, that was defeat dressed as production. They did not see the trap they had set for themselves, complexity as identity, artisanship as strategy, time as a negotiable instrument. Weapon A was a marvel. It was also a calendar crime scene. When demand spiked, it could not multiply without dragging its ghosts, setups, sign-offs, specialists into every new bay. The result was inevitable breathtaking performance in the air, and a trickle at the dock. Low output was not a bug. It was the price of their pride paid daily compounding. Across the ocean, the problem was indecently practical. The United States did not need a handful of masterpieces. It needed a sky full of airplanes now. Fronts multiplied faster than procurement forms, island chains, desert convoys, Atlantic gaps, continental skies. Reliability wasn't a virtue. It was oxygen. If a squadron could not fly tomorrow because a fitting cracked today, and the spare was a month away, doctrine and courage were trivia. Quantity was strategy. Interchangeability was tactics. Delivery was victory. So the philosophy shifted from craft to the limit, to flow, to the fight. The new catechism began with drawings. They belonged to the program, not to a guild. They were dimensioned for production, not for virtuosity. Tolerances were where they mattered, and nowhere else, stacked with the cynicism of people who knew a gauge would decide, not a mythic foreman's thumb. Parts that did not justify machining were stamped. Parts that did not justify stamping were bought. Parts that did not justify uniqueness were standardized. If 3 variants solved a problem, 1 survived. Variants were vampires, invite one in, and your cycle time lost blood. The factory became a river. Tooling was modular fixtures, swappable lines paced by takt, the beat that turns a promise into a schedule. A station could be improved without stopping the flow. A jig could be pulled, corrected, and reinserted, while buffer stocks bled and refilled. Quality moved upstream gauges at the station, not at the shrine of final inspection. Inspectors trained to say stop when a drift appeared and rewarded for catching it when it was cheap. The worker who joined yesterday could hit spec because the spec lived in fixtures, not folklore. Process discipline lowered the skill floor and raised the output ceiling. Suppliers were not courtiers. They were organs in a system. Contracts favored those who built to print and shipped to promise. If a heat treat shop missed its window, a second and third shop were already taught and tooled. Transportation was not heroics. It was timetables, boxcars met by forklifts, met by line feeders. And in the background, the unromantic geniuses went to work, methods engineers shaving seconds from reach and motion. Industrial psychologists rebalancing stations to avoid muscular fatigue. Schedulers gaming calendars to absorb holidays and sick days without starving downstream bays. Reliability started in human bodies long before it landed in crankcases. Training mirrored production. Pilots didn't need bespoke animals. They needed aircraft that started, ran, and forgave. When a crate arrived with a bent rib, a replacement could be pulled from any depot. When a hydraulic line leaked in Burma, a line from Kansas fit because the thread and flare were the same religion. Manuals were written for the late-night corporal, not the factory savant. And because the system assumed failure, it also assumed recovery redundancy, in spares as redundancy, in suppliers redundancy, in knowledge. The cruelty of war met the kindness of design that tolerated abuse. The untold problem. Needing many now forced a heresy that won the war, build for the schedule first, then perfect inside the schedule. Performance gains were folded into block changes, not daily whim. Retooling road-planned shutdowns, not panic. Sanctified parts became modular kits that could be swapped without recertifying the entire airframe. The question behind every improvement was simple: does this raise sortie count next month? Not just kill one more knot today. Mass production was not ugliness. It was mercy for the crews who could trust their mounts for the quartermasters, who could trust their ledgers for the commanders who could trust tomorrow's plan. America didn't promise perfection. It promised availability. And then it built a civilization of jigs, gauges, and timetables to keep the promise. When the first 1,000 arrived, the second 1,000 were already payable. When the third 1,000 flew, the training pipeline widened to meet them. This was the philosophy: reliability as the first, weapon quantity as the second, and time finally on your side. Willow Run, Michigan. November 1942. Snow dusts the corn stubble beyond a building so broad, the weather has to make 2 attempts to cross it. Inside, the air smells like cutting oil and hot aluminum. A bell rings, not grand like a foundry, but punctual like a train station. America's impossible idea is about to clock in. It begins with a sin against tradition, designing the factory as carefully as the airplane. Engineers in denim jackets stand over plywood mock-ups of stations, moving cardboard silhouettes of workers through motions until reach, lift, and twist fall under the limits written on a clipboard. The airplane is disassembled on paper, not for maintenance but for manufacture. A fuselage becomes ribs, stringers, skins, and rings. A wing becomes spars, ribs, and panels. Each is redimensioned to respect the gauge and the jig before it respects romance. Tooling men roll in fixtures the size of barns. They do not worship them. They design them to come apart. Dowel pins, quick clamps, datum plates, Each fixture has a twin so it can leave the line for correction while the duplicate holds the beat. The word takt becomes a heartbeat on the wall, a clock with teeth. If a station cannot meet takt with 2 hands, it gets 4. If 4 cannot meet it, the geometry moves upstream or downstream. Balance is not a metaphor, it is an hour. Now the human miracle novices who become reliable in a week. Women who ran adding machines last spring set rivets that pass die penetrant this winter because the process holds them upright. Gauges live at the station. Go, no-go pins tell the truth without asking permission. The inspector does not wait at the end like a priest. She walks the line like a coach, stopping drift where it is cheap. Photographs on the wall show the correct squeeze of a shop head. The bad one is circled in red with a number that points to a retrain card. The line does not depend on memory. Memory gets tired at 03:12. Gauges do not. Outside, flat cars arrive under tarps at midnight. Machine tools from shuttered car plants climb onto concrete pads. Electricians hang bus bars. A new mezzanine appears over a weekend, as if a second factory is growing above the first. Logistics earn their own choreography bins with 2-card Kanban. Before Kanban is the word tug trains that feed stations through narrow lanes painted on the floor. When a bin turns red, a runner does not ask. He moves. When a jig bites a gauge, R&R team attacks its repeatability. The problem is not shame. It is a ticket number with a timestamp. The product listens. Access panels migrate to where wrenches want them. Hose routings align with hands, not drawings. Fastener families shrink until a corporal can carry everything he needs in a roll. Complexity hides where it belongs in the fixture, not the part. The airplane does not get dumber. The factory gets smarter, smart enough to forgive a snowstorm, a sick day, a missed shipment, because buffers are calculated, not hoped. The number on the wall is still heresy output measured in days, then hours. But the shape it takes is practical holiness. The line does not bully, it entrains. When a new block change arrives, a strengthening of a rib, a relocation of a pump, it is absorbed during a planned pause and echoed across satellites: Inglewood, Fort Worth, Tulsa, Marietta. Standard work is parchment. Change control is scripture. The impossible idea is simply this: build the ability to build, then let it compound. A nation learns to schedule courage. Numbers then, not the myth, the math. Rate a craft culture ships when the masterpiece is ready. A flow culture ships to a beat. On one side, monthly tallies rise and crash with the moods of bottlenecks: 1 tool room, 1 alloy heat, 1 missing specialist. On the other, cadence holds a wing every few minutes, a fuselage every hour bracket. Final rollouts counted in steady pulses across shifts. If you plot them, one curve looks like weather, the other looks like a metronome. War prefers metronomes. Ratio. In the early years, the axis can match categories, fighters for fighters, bombers for bombers, because time is still short and damage still light. But the slope matters. As the calendar ticks toward the middle of the war, aggregate output tilts. By peak, American aircraft production sits in a band that turns many into overwhelming, while German output, despite heroic salvage and dispersion, cannot climb into the same sky. The rough ratio hardens to a truth: you can be brilliant and still be outnumbered 2-to-1 across the categories that decide a campaign. Cycle time. The enemy measures assembly in artisanal days. The arsenal measures it in station minutes. A complex subassembly that once consumed a bay for a week now rides on a moving fixture in half that, because tasks are split, sequenced, and balanced. The invisible win is rework avoided. Statistical process control, quiet charts in a foreman's pocket, catches a drift in whole size before it becomes a cascade of misfits 10 stations later. Every defect killed upstream is a day saved downstream. Days are squadrons. Cost not in money alone, but in attention. A bespoke build eats management hours like a furnace. Every exception demands a meeting. The secret sauce reduces exceptions by designing the exception path, red bins, and on-calls, layered audits. The factory learns to confess quickly. A confessed fault is a cheap fault. The balance sheet experiences a miracle that isn't unit cost declines, because variation declines, because fixtures remember even when workers rotate, because procurement buys families of parts, not unique baubles that vanish when a bridge is bombed. Man-hours per airframe. The axis pours skill into the part. The arsenal pours skill into the process. A single additional jig that indexes skins without shim stock saves a minute per panel, which saves an hour per wing, which saves a day per ship multiplied by thousands. Methods. Engineers measure reach, lift, and walk. A two-step reduction across 100 stations is not small. It is air superiority a month sooner. Process capability, CPCTK, stops being a textbook ghost and becomes whether the engine mount holes actually line up without a pry bar at 3 in the morning. Change control in the craft world. A tweak is a whisper between masters. In the flow world, a tweak is a controlled explosion, reviewed, timed, rolled across plants with kits and instructions. Block changes bundle goodness, so the line never loses its beat. That beat is sacred. Everything else submits. Why unlimited capacity becomes strategy? Because war is attrition in disguise. The side that can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them owns the initiative. Sorties are scheduled, not wished. Training slots expand in lockstep with deliveries. Spares arrive before the failure curve crests. Availability, not peak performance, is the killer statistic. If your fighter is marginally inferior on paper, but flies today, tomorrow, and the day after, while the enemy's perfect machine waits on a part, you win the week. Weeks win theaters. And there is the moral geometry. A system that forgives fatigue, weather, and human error will outlast a system that requires virtuosos. The secret sauce is not one ingredient. It is a kitchen fixtures, gauges, takt, block changes. SPC layered audits logistics that arrive like sunrise. Pour it over aluminum, steel, fuel, and training, and you get something the enemy cannot duel, only drown under availability at scale. Germany. 25. February 1944. Operation Argument. The week the sky became a factory floor. They would call it Big Week later, as if you could condense thunder into a calendar entry. The plan married arithmetic to metal day after day. The 8th Air Force from England and the 15th from Italy would strike the spine of German aviation airframe plants, engine works, bearing shops, repair depots. The axis of effort was not a single target, but a production system. If the arsenal could keep time, the enemy's metronome would break. Weapon B arrives not as a solitary savior, but as a doctrine made visible, long-range escorts that refused to turn back at the old limits. P-51s with drop tanks and disciplined fuel curves slide into formation at altitude where the cold turns breath into smoke and men into numbers. Below and ahead, bomber boxes, B-17s and B-24s stack into measured geometry, an airborne assembly line that manufactures destruction. The schedule is ruthless. Sorties launch in waves, merge, split, and return. Maintenance crews turn ships as fast as line chiefs call the next serial. If one element stumbles, the next fills the slot. The toolkit is availability, the product is pressure. On the first day, the Luftwaffe comes up hard. It has to. Interceptors bite at the stream cannon flash and contrails lashing the air like white whips. Old tactics head-on attacks, high-side dives meet a new ecosystem. Escorts fly the weave, detach in flights to slash at forming fighters, then reattach to the bomber track without spending the formation's bank account of fuel. The miracle is not the dogfight, it is the choreography. Radios chatter then quiet as brevity codes become muscle memory. A crippled fort slides out of the box, another slides in. Gunners swap tracers through a common language of angles and closure rates learned in 1,000 training hours generated by 1,000 classrooms. Factories burn. Yes, Gotha. Leipzig, Mokow. Regensburg, Schweinfurt's bearings again. But the deeper burn is in calendars. Repair shops that counted on predictable nights find their shifts smashed into fragments. Engine plants that rationed alloy see their stockrooms torched just as new jigs were due. And still the sky fills. The second day, the third, the fourth, the arsenal's promise made audible in the cough and roar of takeoff queues that stretch past dispersal pads. Weapon B's secret is not its speed or firepower. It is that there are enough of them to be ordinary. An extraordinary fighter multiplied until it becomes a reliable fact. Between missions, the ground tells the rest of the story. Crew chiefs jack and patch sheet metal men close wounds with a surgeon's speed. Armorers feed belts until palms blister, and oil crews drain and fill on cues that look like ballet from the catwalk. If a magneto flakes, a spare comes from a depot that exists because months ago a purchasing officer insisted on common part numbers across blocks. If a drop tank leaks, a new batch waits because a rubber supplier 3 states away was taught the spec and paid to hold inventory. No heroics, just a system that forgives fatigue because it planned for fatigue. The Luftwaffe bleeds pilots it cannot replace on time. Training fields that once graduated aristocrats of the air now trickle wings to the front. Fuel shortages cut sorties into half days. Maintenance cannibalizes tomorrow to get one more scramble today. At briefing boards west of the Rhine, the math grows poisonous. Intercept here, here, and here, except the escorts are there, and still there because their legs are long and their numbers longer. Weapon B has lengthened the bomber's arm and thickened its skin, and in doing so has lengthened the war for German industry while shortening its oxygen. By the week's end, wreckage writes a ledger across fields and factories. The Allies lose ships, many too many for any man who walks a line of empty bunks, but the stream is not interrupted. That is the test and the answer. A system that can repeat the blow without a long breath between strikes is a war machine, not a raid. Big Week is not a single victory. It is the first sustained proof that the arsenal can schedule shock. From now on, targets do not recover. They degrade. The enemy can win a morning. He cannot win the week. And then the lesson rolls forward into spring. With Weapon B riding shotgun, point-blank titans, marshalling yards crack, fuel plants groan. By June, the air over Normandy belongs to the side that ships to schedule. D-Day is logistics on beaches, but it is also air superiority paid for in February. Trial by fire was not a duel, it was an audit. The arsenal passed. The moment is not cinematic, it is clerical. A staff officer in a gray building adds columns of losses against pilot school's engine deliveries and tire allotments, and the sum refuses to balance. He runs the numbers again. The airframe plants can be dispersed to woods and tunnels, but jigs still take time, and time does not respect courage. He looks at the week's claims and at the next week's schedule of possible sorties and sees a new physics and enemy whose shocks are not spikes, but a floor. In squadron huts, veterans notice it in their bones. Scramble calls come more often, landings less decisive. Every time they fight their way into the stream, there are more escorts than yesterday. Fresh paint, fresh faces, fresh confidence. The American fighters do not linger in gallant duels. They break up formations, return to the corridor, and deny space. When a Stoffel manages a pass and snaps a bomber apart, there are still 24 boxes left riding a road in the air that never seems to end. If you shoot down one truck in a convoy 100 miles long, What have you achieved? The convoy does not notice. Horror arrives as routine. You can plan for terror. You cannot plan for boredom that kills. Every day looks like the last day, only with fewer men and more paperwork. The mechanics trade parts like playing cards. The best aircraft cannibalize the worst, creating peak machines for a dwindling pool of pilots. The briefing officer talks of tactical finesse, vertical maneuver, mutual support, old magic, but the young hands around the map are thinking about fuel for the drive back and whether the new boy on the line remembers the torque on the cylinder bank. Even excellence cannot outrun attrition when the taps are dry. The realization spreads at the periphery first. Trainmasters report yards that cannot be cleared because repairs soak crews. Refinery managers whisper that octane promises are poetry when the rail spurs are cut. Dispersal sites report a new enemy predictability. The attacks arrive on a beat. On days when weather shields the Reich, the relief is physical like anesthesia. On clear days, resignation precedes engines. They used to fear aces, now they fear schedules. And somewhere higher in a minister's office, a different confession hardens. The craft ideal, perfection per unit, virtuoso per station. The workshop as temple has turned from strength into trap. The fixes are known, simplify, standardize trust gauges over guilds, embrace flow. But turn that wheel too late and the teeth skip. You cannot re-architect a production culture under bombardment and expect it to sing by next quarter. The enemy did this 2 years ago when the sky was quiet, and now collects the compounded interest. Pilots put it plainer. They come back from sorties with eyes that seem older than the rest of their faces and say without theater, there are too many of them. Not better every time, just there every time. The escorts do not taunt, they prohibit. The bombers are not invincible. They are inevitable. This is how despair wears a uniform, not in collapsed courage, but in the knowledge that your bravery feeds a furnace that never cools. The word attrition changes flavor. Once it meant trading losses until skill and boldness bent the curve. Now it means feeding a fixed table while the other side keeps adding chairs. Losses are no longer discrete tragedies. They are line items that won't reconcile. A commander who once planned in sorties and squadrons now plans in weeks of survival for particular factories and fuel depots. He reports temporary interruptions that feel permanent. He promises localized recoveries that melt by the next weather window. And yet the enemy's secret is not cruelty. It is indifference. The arsenal does not hate you. It does not even know you. It knows takt gauge fixture, training slot, and shipping date. It will bury you in airplanes, not because it wants to, but because it can. That is the final crushing recognition. You are not losing to a better duelist. You are losing to a better calendar. The war you trained for was a contest of machines and men. The war you are in is a contest of systems. In that war, the side that repeats wins. Victory does not arrive as a trumpet blast. It rolls in like a calendar. After Big Week, the production gap ceases to be an argument and becomes terrain. The Allies now fight on a battlefield made of numbers, sortie rates, replacement factors, depot, turnaround, octane flow. On that ground, the Axis's exquisite advantages grow weightless. A perfect interceptor without fuel is sculpture. A flawless airframe without a spare pump is furniture. Meanwhile, the arsenal treats war like a shift schedule and builds tomorrow before today is spent. Air superiority is the first dividend. Escorts at scale sterilize the daylight for the bomber stream and the dusk for the fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe's remaining strength becomes a geography of exceptions units that fight fiercely, then vanish into the deficit between training and replenishment. With the sky pinned to the Allied timetable, the second dividend matures transport. Convoys sail under umbrellas of land-based patrols and carrier arcs. U-boats die faster than their pens can launch replacements. The Atlantic narrows not by distance, but by cadence, ships departing and arriving on beats the enemy cannot interrupt for long. The oil campaign converts arithmetic into physics. Refineries and hydrogenation plants that once recovered from raids now reappear on target folders before repair crews can rewrite their job cards. Stockpiles that once cushioned a month now cushion a week. By summer 1944, aircraft are grounded not by fear, but by famine. Not enough avgas, not enough synthetic oil, not enough truck tires to carry drums through fractured rail yards. The defender's strategy, which assumes intermittent shock and generous recovery windows, bleeds out under steady pressure. Intermittent becomes continuous. Windows become keyholes. Then they close. Production at scale multiplies force in quieter ways. Training pipelines synchronize to delivery curves. New pilots step into cockpits whose manuals match their classrooms, whose spare parts match their depots. Engines share accessories across marks. Propellers mount without shims. 1,000 good enough but identical fasteners replace 100 perfect ones that disagree by thread. On the line, inspectors kill variation early. In the field, mechanics swap modules instead of pleading with miracles. Availability becomes a moral force. When a squadron commander can plan Thursday because he trusts Tuesday's shipments, he risks differently more often, with better aim. On the ground, the arithmetic becomes logistics as maneuver. Normandy's beaches are not simply courage, they are rehearsed conveyance mulberries. Rhino ferries, DUKWs, depots raised from prefabs, airstrips rolled from pierced steel planking. Behind each noun is a ledger: how many per day, per beach, per tide. Armies that once fought to a limit of railheads now fight to a limit of scheduling. When roads clog, bulldozers move hedgerows. When bridges fall, Bailey kits unfold into rivers. The enemy meets an adversary that treats obstacles like work orders. On the Eastern Front, the same logic wears different boots. Trucks and locomotives bred in American factories, tires, spares, and bulk fuel to match stretch operational reach in a theater where distance has always punished ambition. A front that used to hinge on horses and frostbites now hinges on scheduled tonnage arriving at forward dumps on engines that start in the morning and keep starting. Industrial tempo becomes an ally of climate. By 1945, the divergence is irreversible. The Axis still fields pockets of brilliance: jets, rockets, submarines with ideas ahead of materials. But brilliance without throughput is biography, not strategy. A few dozen wonder weapons are swallowed by a sky that flies to plan a sea, that sails to plan a continent, that eats and advances to plan. The production gap has turned the enemy's high craft into low count, his daring into attrition's food. The creed of perfection bows to the liturgy of repetition. And once repetition rules defeat, becomes a when, not an if. History is generous. It leaves even the defeated a sentence to sign their names. After the guns fall silent, the men who built the Axis war machine write in diaries and dictate to interrogators. Their words differ in tone: defiant, rueful, technical, but they circle the same gravitation: we were outproduced, out-repaired, out-replaced. A minister of armaments who once rationalized factories under bombardment later admits the hardest truth, that organization, not oratory, wins a long war. He writes of American methods without romance line balance, interchangeable parts, the audacity to simplify, and concedes that started early, such methods could have doubled his output, but never matched an opponent who had taught millions to keep time. In his telling, Airpower is not merely airplanes, it is a civilization of gauges. A fighter leader who had chased contrails across half a continent recalls the day his pilots met long-legged escorts over the capital, and the sky felt permanently occupied. The famous line, often attributed to Hermann Göring, that when I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost, may be apocryphal, but its sentiment is not. Veterans repeat it because it compresses a ledger into a sentence: the enemy could now be everywhere and often. From the Pacific come quieter acknowledgments. Naval officers speak of raids that arrived as regularly as tides. Army aviators describe maintenance that felt inexhaustible. Fresh engines, fresh rubber, fresh hands. A captured staff study calculates replacement curves and writes almost clinically that American losses were tolerable within the system while theirs consumed the seed corn. No one boasts that their machines were inferior. They say instead that their calendars were. If the Axis enjoyed any final dignity, it was in clarity. The war they had prepared for, a duel of exquisite weapons flown by masters, existed and sometimes favored them. The war they fought to the finish, a contest of systems, did not. Their final words are not a hymn to Allied genius or a plea for their own. They are an anatomy lesson: simplify, standardize, schedule, or lose to those who do. Close the file. We return to our first image, a room where men once laughed at a number. The number grew into a chart. The chart became a factory. The factory became weather. And when weather settles over a continent, no pilot, no slogan, no masterpiece of craft can part it for long. The calendar, indifferent and exact, had the last line.